A woman in Australia left her home and disappeared without a trace, leaving her husband and 2 children behind. Relatives tried to contact her, but after several weeks of unsuccessful attempts, they decided to turn to the police. An investigation was conducted, and it was concluded that the woman was not in danger and had the right to control her own fate. Since then, she has not contacted her family. Only 40 years later did they learn the shocking truth. Lynette Joy Dawson was born on May 5, 1948, in the Australian state of New South Wales. She grew up in a large, loving family with 2 brothers and a sister. Together with her parents, they lived in the small town of Clovelly, which is essentially a suburb of Sydney. Lynette was a cheerful child, had many friends, and always tried to help her loved ones. Her parents decided to send her to Sydney Girls High School, believing it would be the best choice for her. The school often held events in conjunction with Sydney Boys High School, and in 1965, at one of these events, Lynette met a boy named Chris Dawson. They were both 16 years old, and soon the couple began dating. After finishing school, Lynette decided to pursue a career in medicine. She wanted to help people, so she chose to become a nurse. At the same time, she took a part-time job at a childcare center. When Chris and Lynette were 21, they decided to get married. The couple got married in 1970. The newlyweds moved to the northern suburb of Sydney called Bayview, where the woman got a job at a local hospital. Chris was actively involved in sports and played professional rugby since 1972. He had a twin brother named Paul, with whom they were in the same sports team. Later, they both decided to end their professional careers and became physical education coaches at one of the Sydney schools. Chris and Lynette dreamed of a large family, but they struggled to conceive for a long time. After 6 years of unsuccessful attempts, they began to consider adopting a child from an orphanage. But Lynette finally became pregnant, and the couple had their first daughter, followed by their second. Lynette and Chris were happy to finally have children. Their family seemed exemplary to friends and acquaintances, but soon the first signs of trouble began to appear in this idyllic picture. Lynette's friends started to notice bruises and injuries on her body periodically. When asked about it, Lynette claimed that it was nothing serious and her friends shouldn't worry about it. Lynette's friends were concerned for her, but they didn't see what was happening as something truly terrible. In those days, domestic violence wasn't considered a serious crime in the eyes of a significant portion of society in Australia. Moreover, everyone who knew Chris considered him a loving husband and caring father who never showed signs of aggression and was a positive person. Therefore, their friends tried not to interfere in their marriage and hoped that the couple would solve their problems. But the relationship between Lynette and Chris only continued to deteriorate. Lynette noticed that her husband had cooled towards her and was worried about the future of their family. A few years after the birth of their daughters, they decided to use the services of a nanny. Chris suggested this job to one of his 15-year-old school students, Bev McNally, but she didn't stay in this part-time job for long. She witnessed Chris raising his hand to Lynette twice and decided to leave. After this, Chris offered this job to another of his 16-year-old students, Joanne Curtis. After some time, Joanne had problems in her family, and Chris offered her to stay with them for some time so she could spend more time looking after the children until the situation in her family improved. Despite her kindness and desire to help people, Lynette was against this. She was deeply concerned about the problems in their own family and didn't want someone else to be constantly present in their home. However, Chris insisted on it, and in October 1981, Joanne moved in with them. The young woman lived with them for about a month until Lynette discovered that her husband was sleeping with Joanne. It was a real shock for her and another blow to their marriage. She kicked Joanne out of the house but decided not to divorce Chris. Lynette wanted to keep their family together for the sake of their children, and she continued to love her husband despite his actions. Just a few months later, on December 3, 1981, Lynette faced yet another shock. Chris left her a note saying that he was leaving the family. He wrote that he would move to another city with Joanne and asked his wife not to portray him in a bad light to the children. Lynette was devastated by this news, but a few days later, she was surprised again. Chris returned home because Joanne changed her mind about avoiding him in another city and asked to be taken back. Meanwhile, Chris spent New Year's Eve with Joanne, leaving his wife alone with the children. At that time, Joanne moved into Chris's brother's house, which was on the same street. Despite everything that was happening, Lynette wanted to keep their family together no matter what, so she decided to enroll in family therapy. Chris was against this idea, but she managed to convince him. She went to see the specialist right after New Year's, and it seemed that the therapy had a positive effect on their relationship. Chris started to spend more time with his wife and showed a desire to fix everything. On January 8, 1982, Lynette called her mother and told her that the family therapy was going well. They also agreed to meet with her and other relatives at the local beach the next day. Her mother thought that her daughter's speech sounded a bit unclear, as if Lynette was drunk. The woman explained that Chris had prepared some alcoholic drink for her. The next day, the relatives were waiting for Lynette on the beach, but she never showed up. They called her at home, and Chris said that he had driven his wife to the bus stop that morning. She was going to the store to return some clothes that didn't fit. However, she never returned home, and her relatives began to worry. In the evening, Chris called Lynette's mother and told her that his wife had contacted him by phone. She said that because of the problems in their marriage, she had decided to be away from home for a while and gather her thoughts. Her relatives thought that what was happening was strange, as they were aware of the problems that had been building up between the spouses for years. But they still couldn't imagine Lynette leaving her 2 daughters. She loved her children more than anything in the world and never mentioned considering the possibility of going somewhere. Days passed, but Lynette still didn't contact her family, which only added to their worry. On January 12th, Chris reported that Lynette had called their home phone and said that she was okay. Since then, he had spoken to her a few more times and told her relatives that she had been using her bank card. Despite this, her family continued to doubt that Lynette was okay. She didn't know how to drive and didn't take any items that she might need for a living. She even left behind cash that was hidden in case of an emergency. 3 weeks later, Lynette's eldest daughter started first grade, as the school year in Australia begins in January. But Lynette missed this event, which caused even more concern for her relatives. They were practically certain that something bad had happened to her, while Chris said that she continued to regularly call home, and the last such call was at the end of January. Since then, Lynette hadn't been in contact. On February 18th, 6 weeks after Lynette left home, her husband went to the police. He filed a missing person report and expressed suspicion that amid all the problems in their marriage, Lynette could have joined some religious organization or even a cult. Her relatives denied such a possibility, as Lynette was not religious and didn't attend church. The police began a search, but they had absolutely no leads. Lynette's mother and other members of her family were certain that she would never leave home, abandoning her daughters. So they believed that she had been kidnapped or some other tragedy had occurred. Despite this, the police concluded that Lynette had indeed left home, as they had no evidence of the contrary. They tried to find her for some time and then stopped the investigation. Chris posted a message for Lynette in the local newspaper, calling for her to come home. He wrote that he loved her and was eagerly awaiting her call. He also called all of her friends, trying to find any information about his wife's whereabouts. Despite Chris's eagerness to find Lynette, he divorced her a year after her disappearance, and the next year, he married Joanne Curtis, his former student and lover who had moved in with him. On January 10, 1982, a day after Lynette went missing, Joanne became the stepmother of Lynette's daughters, and Chris, not wanting to traumatize the children with the stories of their mother's disappearance, told them that Joanne was their real mother. Lynette's relatives were not happy about what was happening, but they couldn't do anything about it. They stopped relying on the police, as they had long ago stopped investigating due to the complete lack of leads. Moreover, they didn't even try to question all of her relatives and friends, and the case was abandoned almost immediately without a proper investigation. Chris and Joanne moved to Queensland with the children, selling their old house. Chris almost completely cut ties with his former wife's relatives, only occasionally calling her mother. Later, Chris and Joanne had a daughter. 6 years passed, and during that time, Lynette never contacted anyone. This continued until 1990, when something unexpected happened. Chris and Joanne divorced, and soon after that, Joanne contacted Lynette's relatives to pass on shocking information. She said that she had suspected her husband of murdering his ex-wife all this time. According to her, a month before Lynette's disappearance, Chris had talked about hiring a hitman to get rid of her. On the very day she disappeared, he told Joanne that Lynette had left forever and would never return. She also advised the police to search the backyard of the house where Lynette and Chris lived. In 1991, the police questioned Chris. He said that his ex-wife was just trying to tarnish his name and that he had nothing to do with Lynette's disappearance. He admitted that the woman was intentionally doing this to get custody of their daughter after the divorce. At that time, the court was deciding who would have custody of their child, and Chris's arrest would have been beneficial to Joanne. Police seized phones from Chris and his brother, but nothing suspicious was found. So investigators once again abandoned the case, considering Joanne's words dubious. The case remained dormant for another 9 years until 2000, when the police decided to excavate the backyard of Chris's old home. But there was a catch. Due to insufficient funding, they only dug around the pool area. This area was chosen after police talked to the new homeowners. According to them, during the sale, Chris persistently asked if they planned to change anything exactly in this place. The only thing that the police managed to find was a torn pink cardigan. Investigators admitted that it could have belonged to Lynette and contained some evidence, but DNA analysis found no matches with Lynette. A year later, the case was once again brought to attention. This time, the deputy state prosecutor concluded that Lynette was killed by someone she knew. Police resumed the investigation, questioning her friends and relatives, but they failed to find any leads. Only in 2003, 2 years later, investigators publicly announced that they considered Chris a suspect. They wanted to charge him with murder, but it never happened due to the complete lack of evidence. The man could not be convicted, but investigators managed to find many witnesses who reported that Chris and his brother regularly had intimate relationships with their school students. However, no charges were brought on this matter, and as a result, the case stalled again. In 2006, Chris claimed that he saw his wife among the extras of a series filmed in England, but no one could find any evidence to support his words. In 2010, police announced a $100,000 reward for information about Lynette's disappearance, and 4 years later, they doubled the amount. Despite the large number of appeals, this did not bring any results, and they failed to find any reliable leads. In 2015, police dug up a section of Chris's former home, trying to find his wife's body, but they were unsuccessful. The turning point in this case came in 2018 when a podcast about Lynette's disappearance was released and gained massive popularity in Australia. Arguments were presented in favor of Lynette's husband being responsible for her murder. The podcast was listened to by several million people, which led to a wave of public outrage. Australians accused the police of negligence and demanded that the culprit be punished. The podcast author, Hadley Thomas, spoke to Lynette's relatives and tried to find new leads, although he was unable to find any new evidence against Chris. The public outcry was enough to initiate a new investigation. As a result, on December 5th of that year, detectives arrested Chris for the first time on charges of murder. He continued to insist on his innocence and was released on bail before the start of the trial. The trial dragged on for several years. In 2019, he appeared before a judge and claimed that he did not kill his wife and that the trial should have started in 2020. But Chris's lawyers consistently delayed the process. They insisted that due to the widespread coverage of the case in the media, their client had a biased attitude towards him. So they demanded that they abandon the jury and conduct a trial where the judge would make the decision. In May 2022, this demand was approved and the trial finally began. Chris's lawyers insisted that there was not a single piece of evidence against their client, and all the charges were based on societal bias due to the podcast. According to them, the author presented his opinion in such a way that many believed in Chris's guilt and refused to adequately evaluate the situation. Despite the lack of direct evidence on the prosecution side, they built their case on a multitude of indirect factors. Relatives and acquaintances of Lynette who had repeatedly seen signs of abuse on her body testified in court, and Lynette had admitted to them that Chris was responsible. Their neighbors who witnessed the man beating her also testified in court. Relatives and acquaintances of Lynette who had repeatedly seen signs of abuse on her body testified in court. Lynette had admitted to them that Chris was responsible. Their neighbors, who witnessed the man beating her, also testified in court. They recounted that the day before Lynette's disappearance, when she returned to family therapy, she had bruises on her neck. One of the key witnesses was Joanne, who revealed that as she grew older, she realized how unhealthy her relationship with Chris was. He became obsessed with her when she was only 15 years old. He would leave notes in her backpack at school and ask her out. On days he was persistent and didn't take no for an answer, so the young woman felt like she had nowhere to turn. According to Joanne, Chris completely controlled her life. He told her what to wear, who to talk to, and what to do. He monitored her every move and couldn't stand it when things didn't go according to his plan. As a result, the woman concluded that the man could have easily killed his wife. According to the prosecution, Chris had wanted to end the marriage for a long time, but he would have lost part of his property and custody of the children in the divorce, so he decided to kill Lynette and stage her disappearance. In addition, he wanted to get rid of her so that she wouldn't interfere with his relationship with Joanne. Chris's lawyers, on the other hand, insisted that Joanne had made all of this up to intentionally slander her ex-husband. They also called several witnesses who claimed to have seen Lynette years after her disappearance. These testimonies became the mainstay of the defense, but there was no evidence to support their claims. The prosecution believed that these testimonies were simply fabricated and that if Lynette was alive, she would have contacted her relatives and daughters over the years. As for the phone calls that Chris allegedly received in the first month of her disappearance, no evidence of their existence could be found. The prosecution argued that the woman was already dead at that time and the man made it all up to convince Lynette's relatives that she was okay. In their view, Chris killed the woman on January 9th, drove her body in an unknown direction, and hid it because the police were negligent in their work. In those years, no proper investigation was conducted, although the killer's motives were always obvious. The trial lasted for 10 weeks, and on August 30th, 2022, the judge found Chris guilty. A few months later, in early December, the sentence was announced: 24 years in prison with the possibility of applying for early release after 18 years of imprisonment. Considering that he will be 92 years old by then, Chris may simply not live to see that time. After the sentence was handed down, Lynette's relatives, including her eldest daughter, spoke. She no longer doubted that her father had killed her mother and said that his actions had destroyed her life. The woman demanded that her father confess where he had hidden Lynette's body so the family could finally bury her. But Chris remained silent and looked at the floor while his daughter spoke. Despite the fact that almost 41 years have passed since Lynette's murder, her relatives still hope to find her remains. Chris, who is now 74 years old, continues to insist on his innocence. But even his own children do not believe him. Thus, one of Australia's most high-profile cases was solved, in large part thanks to a podcast that drew the attention of millions of people to this unjust story. If the police had conducted a proper investigation from the beginning, the killer could have been punished immediately after the crime, not after 4 decades. Share your opinion in the comments and don't forget to like this video if you enjoyed it. Thank you. A young woman moved to another city for her studies and stayed with an acquaintance. What happened next seemed like a twisted plot of a detective movie than a real-life situation. For several years, this story troubled the police until the unexpected truth finally came to light. Jonah Berry was born on October 26, 1983, in Bristol, Tennessee. She was lively and sociable, had many friends, and was always the life of the party during her school years. She was also part of the local cheerleading team. After high school, Jonah enrolled at East Tennessee State University, where she studied psychology and criminalistics. While studying, she also worked part-time at a children's educational center. During her time at the university, she met a guy named Jason White. They dated for several years, and shortly before graduation, they got engaged. In late 2004, when Jonah was 21 years old, she decided to pursue a master's degree in psychology, which required her to temporarily move to Knoxville to study at a different university. After working at the Children's Center, Jonah realized her passion for this field and aspired to become a child psychologist. Meanwhile, her boyfriend continued his studies in another state, aiming to obtain a law degree. Despite the distance, the couple communicated every day and started preparing for their wedding, which was only a few months away in Knoxville. Jonah planned to find her own accommodation but stayed with her friend Jason Amami for the first few weeks. He had studied with her and her boyfriend at the university, and after graduating, he moved to Knoxville. He lived in a 2-bedroom apartment and agreed to host Jonah until she found a place of her own. Jonah found 2 part-time jobs at a jewelry store and a children's hospital. On the evening of December 5th, after finishing her shift at the store, she went to the shopping center to buy Christmas presents. When she returned home, she packed some gifts intended for the children at the educational center, chatted with her apartment neighbor, and went to her room. There, she talked to her boyfriend on the phone and went to sleep around 4 a.m. Jason Amami woke up to a woman's scream. He thought Jonah had a nightmare and headed to her room. At that moment, a man emerged from the room and Jason noticed a knife in his hand. The assailant immediately attacked him, delivering several blows. Jason tried to defend himself and managed to push the attacker away at some point.
He ran out of the apartment and quickly ran to the neighboring residential complex, knocking on every door, hoping someone would call the police.
But no one opened for him. He then sprinted to the nearest 24-hour store, almost a kilometer away. The store clerk called 911 upon seeing the bloodied man and Jason recounted what happened. The police arrived at his home and discovered Jonah lying on the floor next to the corridor door that connected 5 apartments. The young woman was alive but barely responsive. As the paramedics prepared to load her into the ambulance, a police officer asked if the attacker was still in the apartment, and Jason thought he saw Jonah nod ever so slightly. The officers thoroughly searched the entire building and the surrounding area but failed to find him. Jonah was swiftly transported to the nearest hospital, but despite the efforts of the doctors, they were unable to save her. Medical experts determined that she had sustained over 20 knife wounds, leaving them with virtually no chance of saving her life. As for her neighbor, the assailant had managed to inflict 8 wounds on him, with only one being serious. The medics provided him with the necessary care, and his life was not in danger. Meanwhile, detectives began investigating the crime scene. From the bloodstains in the corridor, they deduced that Jonah had attempted to reach out to her neighbors and seek help, but none of the 4 residents had opened their doors. Next to the door to Jonah's room, investigators found the murder weapon, a kitchen knife belonging to Jason. The assailant had struck with such force that the blade had bent. Additionally, the police discovered blood traces near the back door of the apartment and on the staircase leading from the 2nd floor to the street. Considering that Jason and Jonah had exited through the front door, the detectives concluded that the murderer had left the crime scene through the back door.
Another lead awaited them in Jason's room.
They found a partial footprint that the perpetrator may have left when following the apartment owner and launching the attack. Considering the brutality with which the killer had dealt with Jonah, the police suspected that the crime was personal in nature. Their first step was to closely scrutinize Jonah's fiancé, Jason White. Despite him being approximately 1,000 kilometers away from Knoxville, all friends and relatives attested to the couple having a wonderful relationship, and there seemed to be no motive for the fiancé to commit such a heinous crime. The young man only learned about his fiancé's death at 10 a.m. when her mother called him. He said that after hearing the news, he fainted and took a long time to recover. He had to ask his neighbor to book a plane ticket for him and pack his suitcase since he was incapable of doing anything himself. Detectives thoroughly examined his alibi and concluded that he physically couldn't have traveled to Knoxville and returned by morning. As a result, he was eliminated as a suspect, and the investigators turned their attention to Jonah's neighbor. Unlike the victim's fiancé, the neighbor had no alibi. Jason was in the same apartment as her and could have committed the crime. Friends and relatives of Jonah were also suspicious of him, with some considering him the most likely killer. Others accused him of fleeing the apartment and leaving the young woman alone, leading the victim's parents to not even want him to attend her funeral. Immediately after Jason was discharged from the hospital, the detectives began interrogating him. The young man stuck to his initial version of events. He woke up to a scream, saw an unknown man, and was attacked when he managed to push the assailant away.
Jason rushed to the front door and ran outside, attempting to reach the neighbors.
He believed that Jonah had also managed to leave the apartment since he no longer heard her screams. However, the police were hesitant to believe this account. The first thing that made them suspect Jason was his injuries. 7 out of the 8 wounds proved to be non-life-threatening, and the last one on his right hand could have been sustained during both defense and attack. Furthermore, forensic experts found no signs of forced entry in the apartment, indicating that the perpetrator was already inside. Jason himself mentioned that he had taken out the trash through the back door that evening but couldn't remember if he had locked it or not. Detectives continued to press him, paying particular attention to the door he used to run out onto the street. Jason insisted that it was the front door, but the police suspected he was lying. If he had exited through the back door, it would explain the bloody traces near the door and on the stairs.
In that case, it would further implicate him. Additionally, the police accused him of using and selling illicit substances and behaving aggressively when unable to obtain a dose.
Jason denied all of these allegations, but the investigators kept bombarding him with various accusations.
After spending several hours with Jason at the police station, the detectives offered him a polygraph test, and he agreed. They brought in an expert who asked leading questions, and at the end of the interview, informed him that the polygraph indicated that he had given false answers. Upon hearing this, Jason entered a state of close to hysteria. He screamed that he had nothing to do with the crime and feared for his life as the real perpetrator was still at large. However, the detectives didn't believe him. Nevertheless, they couldn't arrest him for murder since there was no evidence against Jason. They had to wait for the laboratory experts to finish examining the few pieces of evidence found in the apartment. Then, an unexpected turn of events occurred. On the knife used as the murder weapon, 3 DNA samples were found, those of the deceased young woman, Jason, and an unknown male. The unknown male's DNA was also discovered in Jonah's room, on the back door handle, and on the staircase used by the perpetrator to flee. Furthermore, a fingerprint left by the victim's blood was found on the knife handle, and it didn't match Jason's fingerprint. These discoveries made the police doubt that he was the killer. The evidence confirmed that someone else was indeed present in the apartment that night. However, comparing the DNA samples to existing databases yielded no results. Despite the detectives no longer considering Jason as the murderer, public opinion remained against him. He was accused of fleeing and abandoning his girlfriend instead of trying to protect her. In addition to that, Jason began to suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder. Soon, another interesting fact emerged. It turned out that the polygraph operator had simply misinterpreted the instrument's readings. In reality, there were no signs indicating that Jason was lying. Furthermore, the police had no actual evidence linking the young man to illicit substances. They accused him solely to exert additional pressure. Most importantly, the police initially downplayed the severity of the injuries Jason sustained. In reality, he had suffered serious harm, with his lung and neck being severely damaged. Full recovery was unlikely. Due to these police reports, the insurance company only covered 25% of the medical expenses, and Jason experienced significant financial difficulties. After Jason ceased being a suspect, the police began questioning him as a witness. Based on his statements, they created an approximate profile of the attacker. The situation was complicated by the fact that Jason couldn't clearly see the assailant's face, as the room was dark, and the perpetrator immediately attacked him when he exited the room. Detectives also discovered something interesting in Jonah's room, a camp near the back staircase. There were scattered discs and a stereo player. Initially, they assumed these items belonged to the victim or Jason, but Jason denied it. According to him, none of those belongings were in his apartment, implying that the killer left them behind. The investigators handed the approximate portrait of the suspect to journalists, and after its publication in the news, the police received hundreds of potential leads. People provided information about acquaintances who even remotely resembled the portrait, and the detectives followed up on each lead. One of them seemed particularly intriguing to a detective. They were informed that in the vicinity of Jonah's murder, there was a group of teenagers known for breaking into houses to commit theft. One of them, a 19-year-old named Michael Perkafau, resembled the suspect's portrait, and the police began searching for him. It wasn't easy since the young man was already wanted for theft. However, now that he was suspected of potential involvement in the murder, dozens of police officers joined the search. They eventually located him and brought him to the station. The investigators immediately noticed his footwear. The pattern on the soles resembled the footprint left by the killer. They collected a DNA sample and fingerprints from him and sent everything to the experts. Meanwhile, they interrogated him. During the questioning, the detectives were in for an unexpected surprise. Michael confessed almost immediately that he and his friend had indeed broken into Jonah's apartment that night. According to Michael's account, their intention was to steal valuable items from Jonah's apartment, but his friend grabbed a knife and attacked her. However, the detectives quickly became skeptical of his story. Firstly, the details Michael provided didn't match the actual facts, and secondly, there were no traces of the presence of two outsiders at the crime scene. The laboratory result only confirmed their skepticism. Michael's DNA and fingerprints did not match those found at the murder scene, and the same applied to his shoes. The pattern on the soles was different from the footprint in Jason's room. Eventually, the police realized that the young man was simply lying. Such situations occur quite often, where individuals take on someone else's guilt. Some do it to seek attention, while others lie in hopes of receiving rewards for information. It's unknown what motives drove Michael, but his story turned out to be fabricated. Since then, investigators have interviewed over 1,000 potential suspects and collected around 400 DNA samples, but they haven't found a single match. From the early weeks of the investigation, a reward was announced for information leading to the resolution of the case. The amount increased each month and reached $60,000 in December of 2005, 1 year after the murder. The state governor added $20,000 from his own pocket, further drawing public attention. Despite the numerous leads, all of them proved to be dead ends, and the case remained unresolved for several years. In 2007, Jonah's parents decided to advocate for changes in the state's legislation. They found it astonishing that the perpetrator's fingerprints and DNA were not found in any of the databases. Considering the brutality of the crime, the parents refused to believe that it was his first offense. Later, they learned that, under the laws of Tennessee, fingerprints and DNA samples were only taken from convicted criminals. Jonah's parents resolved to rectify the situation and participated in the creation of a new law that mandated the collection of these samples from all individuals arrested for violent crimes. The authorities supported this initiative, and in May of 2007, such a law was enacted. 2 months later, a breakthrough finally occurred in the case. The police arrested 22-year-old Taylor Lee Olson for violating the terms of his parole. The man had been convicted of theft, and during a search of his home, marijuana bushes were discovered, leading to his rearrest. Olson had an extensive criminal history, primarily consisting of thefts, check forgery, and car thefts. He had been arrested multiple times, but his fingerprints and DNA were never taken until now. Despite living with his girlfriend and their newborn daughter, Olson regularly committed crimes. It turned out that Olson had already come to the attention of investigators 5 months prior. They received a tip about his possible involvement in the murder, but for some reason, the police never attempted to take his DNA for analysis. However, now that he was arrested for violating the terms of his parole, they finally decided to question him about the Jonah case. Olson denied his involvement in the murder and willingly agreed to provide his DNA sample. It was handed over to experts, and soon, the detectives received a report from the laboratory. Taylor's DNA fully matched the sample found in the victim's apartment. Following this, his fingerprints were taken, and they also matched the print found on the murder weapon. Olson was subsequently arrested, and the detectives brought him in for questioning. At first, he denied his guilt, but soon, he decided to confess. Taylor explained that on that night, he wanted to steal Jonah's car and entered the apartment through the back door to take the keys. When he entered the young woman's room, she woke up and started screaming. That's when Olson grabbed a kitchen knife and struck her multiple times. Although he claimed he did not intend to kill anyone and it all happened accidentally, the detectives doubted the truthfulness of some aspects of his account and leaned toward the belief that Taylor had initially planned the murder. It was possible that he had been stalking the victim for some time, indirectly supported by a fact mentioned earlier in the investigation. Jonah's friends told investigators that she had been followed by someone in a car. At the time, they couldn't find any evidence to confirm it, but after Olson's arrest, they considered the possibility that he had indeed been stalking her. Despite the doubt surrounding some details, nobody questioned Olson's guilt. His DNA and fingerprint were found on the murder weapon, indicating that he had inflicted the knife wounds on the victim. Olson's trial was scheduled to begin in mid-2008, and by that time, he had already hired a lawyer. Apparently, the lawyer advised him to retract his confession, and Taylor provided a new version of events to the detectives. Now, he claimed that he had entered the apartment together with his friend named Noah Cox. According to Olson, when he entered Jonah's room to take the car keys, she allegedly woke up, grabbed a knife, and struck him multiple times. Olson ran out of the apartment through the back door while his friend went into Jonah's room, where he grabbed the knife from her and killed the young woman. This account also did not convince the police. No fingerprints or DNA of other individuals were found at the crime scene, making the involvement of someone else unlikely. The detectives were awaiting the start of the trial, but it was never meant to happen. On March 28, 2008, Taylor Olson ended his life in his prison cell. Notes addressed to his family, Jonah's relatives, and the police were found next to him. In the letter to the detectives, he once again claimed that his friend Noah Cox was the actual killer and apologized to Jonah's family and his own. The detectives continued to believe that Olson was the one who committed the murder, yet they repeatedly questioned Noah, but no evidence of his involvement could be found. Jonah's parents also believed that he lied. In their opinion, if Taylor was truly innocent, he would not have taken his own life. It was much more likely that he simply didn't want to spend his entire life in prison. Moreover, for several months after his confession, Olson continued to maintain that he entered the apartment alone and that no one was with him. If he was trying to protect his friend, why did he suddenly retract his confession and start accusing him of the murder? Share your opinions on this story in the comments, and don't forget to like this video if you enjoyed it. Thanks.
A woman spending time with her family on a normal Saturday morning heard the doorbell ring and went to answer it. What happened next resembled more the plot of a horror movie than a real-life incident. It took the detective more than 30 years to unravel this terrible mystery, the ending of which shocked and angered everyone. Marlene Warren was born on April 15, 1950 in Michigan, USA. She grew up without a father and since her teenage years dreamed of having a large and close-knit family. Very soon, that dream came true. The girl married a man named John and they had 2 sons. But just a few years later, an unexpected tragedy struck the family. Marlene's husband died suddenly of an illness, and the woman was left alone with 2 small children. Since then, she has spent most of her time at work trying to provide for her sons alone. Although she struggled with this, she sacrificed everything for her children. 6 years after her husband's death, she met a man named Michael Warren, and they soon married. The man was a used car salesman, and after their marriage, he opened his own business in that area. By that time, Marlene was already making good money, but instead of spending it all, she tried to save it. The woman invested in Michael's company and also helped him in the management. The man himself was also good at this business, and in the following years, it began to bring them decent money. Over time, Marlene and her husband expanded the business. They bought several properties to rent, and their finances took off. The family moved to an upscale Miami suburb called Wellington, buying a large house there. They seemed to have built a near-perfect life. But in 1988, Marlene suffered another tragedy. Her oldest son was killed in a car accident. For the woman and her youngest son, Joseph, it was a huge blow. After all the difficulties they had gone through, their life had just gotten better when suddenly fate presented them with yet another test. Yet they found the strength to move on. After this tragedy, Marlene became even closer to Joseph because he was her only closest relative. Her husband also helped her to recover from this loss. After the death of her son, the woman began to think about selling the properties that she and Michael were renting out. Despite the fact that this business brought in good money for Marlene, it was associated with constant worries. There were often situations when tenants delayed rent or lost it altogether. In each such case, the woman did her best to find the best solution. It was very hard for her to put people on the street because she was a good-natured person and well remembered the financial difficulties she experienced with 2 small children. On the other hand, she and her husband could not let people live in their homes for free, and eventually, Marlene wanted to get rid of the business so that she would no longer face such moral dilemmas. 2 years had passed since her son's death, and the family was just beginning to recover and return to normalcy. But something terrible and unforeseen awaited them once again. On the morning of May 26, 1990, Marlene was at home with her son and 3 of his friends who came over for breakfast. Their kitchen was located so that they could see the driveway through the windows. At some point, the doorbell rang and Marlene went to open it. Her son saw a white Chrysler parked in front of their house. The next second, the woman opened the front door and saw a man in a clown costume holding 2 balloons and a bouquet of flowers on the doorstep. Marlene said, "How cute is that?" But the next second, something unexpected happened. The clown pulled a gun out of his pocket and shot the woman in the head. Her son and his friends rushed into the hallway where a heartbreaking sight awaited them. Marlene was lying on the floor with blood everywhere. The man in the clown suit looked at them for a few seconds, then got back into his car and drove away. Marlene's son called an ambulance, after which he decided to chase after his attacker. At the time, his leg was in a cast after an injury, and the guy couldn't drive. He told his 2 friends to stay with his mother, asked his friend to drive, and drove with her in the direction the attacker had gone. But by that time, the clown was out of sight and they never managed to find him. Marlene was taken to the hospital in an unconscious state, and the detectives began their investigation. The first thing they did was talk to everyone in the house. The woman's son said that he could not see any signs of his attacker. He was wearing a suit and makeup, gloves on his hands, and a wig on his head. The only thing the son remembered was that the perpetrator had very dark eyes. His friends added that the clown was quite tall and his shoes stood out strongly against the costume. They looked like work shoes. A neighbor who was walking his dog near Marlene's house also saw the clown, but he was unable to share any significant sightings with police. Investigators put out a search for a white Chrysler and began searching for other evidence. Of course, Marlene's husband, Michael, was the first to be suspected. That morning, he had just left for the racing stadium in Miami, and at the time of the attack on his wife, he was not at home. From the first hours of the investigation, the police had several good reasons to think about his involvement. First, they found out that Marlene and her relatives really liked clowns. There were a lot of pictures and figures depicting these characters in their house. This suggested that the attacker knew this fact and chose such an outfit for a reason. Secondly, just 2 hours after the incident, the police received an anonymous tip from a woman who called the investigators and said they should look into Michael Warren and a woman named Sheila Keene. Sheila, who was 26, worked with Michael at his car rental company. Digging deeper, the detectives learned of rumors that there was a secret affair between them. Their relationship had been speculated about by some colleagues, so they immediately shared this information with investigators. Here, the police discovered another possible motive. If Michael was in a relationship with another woman and wanted to break up with Marlene, he had one problem. Most of the real estate and business that the family owned were written down to his wife. In that case, Michael would lose an impressive part of his fortune in a divorce. The police immediately checked the man's whereabouts at the time of the attack, and it turned out that Michael was in a car 110 kilometers away from the house and had 2 friends with him. Investigators concluded he would not have been physically capable of committing the crime. Upon learning of the attempt on his wife's life, Michael rushed to the hospital and has not left her room since. Officers spoke with Sheila, and she stated that there was no romantic relationship between them and she had nothing to do with the crime. The woman added that she was at work at the time. Detectives also interviewed Sheila's husband, who said he was aware of rumors of an affair between his wife and Michael but could not confirm whether or not it was true. The man added that his wife had moved out about a month ago, and in fact, they were no longer together. Although the police had no evidence to link Michael and Sheila to the crime, they continued to consider their involvement highly probable. Given that the husband could not have physically been outside his house that morning, the police wondered if Sheila could have been the clown because of the costume. None of the witnesses could determine the gender of the assailant for certain, and Sheila was known among her colleagues for her character. The woman was responsible for dealing with clients who were delinquent in rent payments, and most of these cases led to serious conflicts. So Sheila always carried a gun with her. After doctors removed the bullet from Marlene's head, experts determined that it had been fired from a .38 caliber handgun, remarkably the same caliber as Sheila's. The cops went to examine the weapon, but Sheila claimed that the gun had been stolen or lost months before the incident, leaving the detectives with no tangible evidence. They continued to dig deeper and learned that after Sheila moved out of her husband's house, she had moved into a rental apartment. Investigators heard rumors that Michael was paying for the place. A new interesting discovery awaited the police officers. While their colleagues were trying to establish where the perpetrator took the clown costume, balloons, and flowers, they found that on May 24th, 2 days before the attempt on Marlene's life, a woman came to the costume store near Sheila's apartment. The store was already closed, but the woman persistently knocked on the door until someone opened it for her. She urgently needed a clown costume, a wig, face makeup, and a red nose. The store clerks sold her the items. They described her as tall, thin, with dark hair. The balloons and flowers were traced to a supermarket about a mile from Sheila's apartment. The salesman stated that the same items had been bought by a woman just a few hours before the attempt on Marlene's life. He described her as a tall, thin young woman with long dark hair. The salesman also mentioned that the female customer exhibited rude and somewhat masculine manners. The investigation had lasted 2 days, and on May 28th, the doctors informed the police that Marlene had died. The case was reclassified as a homicide. Detectives continued to look for more possible evidence against Sheila. They obtained a warrant to search her apartment. While waiting for the warrant, they were informed of a similar car in a parking lot located 13 kilometers from the victim's home. Investigators got there and verified that it was the same Chrysler the killer was driving. Inside, they found long dark hair and orange fibers that looked like pieces of a clown wig. During a search of Sheila's apartment, the police found the same orange-colored particles and work boots that matched the witness's description, a similar model worn by the clown on the day of the murder. However, the police faced a major problem. Without DNA analysis, all the evidence against Sheila was circumstantial. They couldn't charge her with murder without concrete proof. But in 2013, a new team of investigators reopened the case and requested a re-examination of all available evidence. Advanced technology in DNA examination and other physical evidence had emerged since 1990. After several years of examination, experts found that the orange flecks in Sheila's apartment, the car, and the murder scene were identical. The crucial clue came from comparing the DNA of hairs found in the white Chrysler to Sheila's DNA, which resulted in a perfect match. Armed with this incontrovertible evidence, detectives were able to take the case to court, and in 2017, Sheila was arrested. She pleaded guilty to second-degree murder in exchange for avoiding the death penalty. Her attorneys claimed that she feared for her life and took responsibility for someone else's crime. However, it is widely speculated that she took the plea deal to receive a lenient sentence. The court sentenced her to 12 years in prison, reduced further due to time served and good behavior. As for Michael, his involvement remains unproven, and he remains free. Marlene's son expressed his gratitude to the persistent detectives who never gave up on the case. He managed to rebuild his life, opened his own small construction firm, and moved forward despite the immense tragedy of losing his mother. Share your opinion on this story in the comments, and don't forget to like this video if you liked it. Thanks for watching.